Today, a bust of former Vice President Dick Cheney was unveiled at the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center. He spoke at the ceremony along with former President George W. Bush, current Vice President Joe Biden, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and House Speaker Paul Ryan. This is an hour.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chairman of the Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, Roy Blunt, Senate President Pro Tempore, Orrin Hatch, Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, Speaker of the House of Representatives, Paul D. Ryan, President George W. Bush, and Vice President Dick Cheney. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the presentation of the colors by the United States Armed Forces Color Guard, the singing of our national anthem, and the retiring of the colors. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand as the chaplain of the United States Senate, Dr. Barry Black, gives the invocation.
Let us pray. Eternal God, our refuge and strength, as we begin this unveiling ceremony of the marble bust of Vice President Dick Cheney, we thank you for his service to you and country. Remembering the many years he labored in the political arena, we're grateful for your gifts of people who are passionate about keeping this nation strong. Continue to bless and keep Vice President Cheney and his loved ones as we receive inspiration from his contributions. Remind us that with your power, we are strong enough to overcome the difficulties that trouble our nation and world. Lord, strengthen our commitment to you and country by turning our thoughts toward hope, our hearts toward justice, and our hands toward works of peace. We pray in your sovereign name. Amen.
Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, the chairman of the Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, the Honorable Roy Blunt.
Well, welcome this morning. It's a great opportunity for us to be here and to be part of this presentation of welcoming Vice President Cheney officially to the Capitol as part of the collection that the Senate started in 1885. 130 years ago, the Senate decided it would be appropriate to recognize the Vice President, but principally to recognize the Vice President in his job as President of the Senate, and certainly to get to recognize a person who spent a lot of time in both the House and the Senate as Vice President and before the 46th Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney. The story of Vice Presidents and their impact on the Congress and the country is an important part of our history. And as we celebrate this event today, we get a chance to welcome both current and former members of the House and Senate, some of whom you'll hear from, former members of the Cabinet, Justice Scalia, we're pleased to be joined by him, and of course by President Bush, and before we're done, we'll be joined by Vice President Biden. We're particularly pleased, as I know the Vice President is, to be here with his family, such an important part of his life, and his great partner, Mrs. Cheney. Now, Lynn Cheney, a partner in this project, like she has been a partner in so many other things the Vice President has done. She has a deep appreciation for the history of the country. She's written great children's history and great adult history. She and the Vice President wrote a wonderful book, Speaker Ryan, on Speakers of the House when he was serving in the House, and we were lucky to have her come just last year and visit with senators about her really groundbreaking book on James Madison. When Dick Cheney was a member of the House, I remember him telling me that he and others founded the Dennis Thatcher Society because Mrs. Cheney was the chairman of the National Endowment for Humanities, and in the tradition of Dennis Thatcher, they thought they should band together and see what it was like to have a spouse with a more powerful job than they had. But they have been great partners, and so when Mrs. Cheney said that she thought that William Barron's had truly captured the character of the Vice President when she and the Vice President got to see the bust for the first time, that was probably the most important indication that everything was going to work out all right. We're also very pleased to have William Barron's and Charlotte Barron's, his wife, and members of their family here with us today. This will be the second bust that he has done that will be part of the Vice Presidential collection. He's now working on the third, and that will be the Vice President's Gore's bus that Mr. Behrens is doing. As we're talking today, he is planning that. So Vice President Cheney, welcome back to the Capitol. Will Rogers said that the man with the easiest job in the country was the vice president, because all he had to do was get up every day and say, "How's the president doing?" But recent presidents and recent vice presidents have changed this job a lot since Will Rogers would have said that. Every vice president, starting with John Adams, has done a lot to make their own impact on the country, and uniquely had the opportunity to make an impact on the Congress. Dick Cheney brought to the vice presidency the preparation of a lifetime of service. His no-nonsense approach, his willingness to solve problems, made him an influential and an active part of President Bush's administration. He'd come to that job, actually his first job in Washington was to be a fellowship at the Capitol. 6 years later, he's the Chief of Staff for the President of the United States. One of the quicker moves from intern to Chief of Staff that ever happened. His 10 years in the House, he was the chairman of the Republican Conference. He was the Republican whip. Now, I had that job. I was the majority whip and never lost a vote when I was majority whip. I also, for a little while, was the minority whip, and I lost some votes there. Dick Cheney is the only minority whip who never lost a vote because the president's father, George H.W. Bush, asked him to be Secretary of Defense before he could ever whip a vote. And he holds lots of distinction in the history of the country. It is an honor to be part of this presentation today, and it'll be a great honor to see him recognized and remembered for time immemorial in the Capitol of the United States with this bust.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Majority Leader of the Senate, the Honorable Mitch McConnell.
Richard Bruce Cheney. He's had one of the most interesting careers and one of the most fascinating lives of anyone you'd ever want to meet. As Roy indicated, Chief of Staff, Secretary of Defense, Member of Congress from Wyoming, House Minority Whip, Vice President to President George W. Bush, and Master Fly Fisherman. Many have spent their lives in pursuit of just one of these high offices, and many have failed in the pursuit. That this son of Casper, Wyoming succeeded says, I think, quite a lot about him. Because when Dick Cheney sets his mind to something, he's absolutely determined to achieve it. It's a trait he's well known for. And here's another one. Dick Cheney loves his family. And Len, I want to say how much I enjoyed the biography of James Madison. I had read a few others. Yours literally brought him alive. And one of the things that George Will and I agree on, that we think he's our favorite president who went to Princeton. The other one being Woodrow Wilson, who's been engulfed in some bit of controversy lately. And he loves his daughters, obviously, too. The truth is, for all the vice president's well-deserved reputation as a man of action, we all know Len is the real force in the family. Think tank scholar, public servant, a strong woman who's never afraid to share her opinion on an issue. Dick Cheney might be tough, but Len is tougher. And I think the vice president is just fine with that. Now, here's what's interesting to me as a member of the Senate, and it's the reason we're gathered here today. Dick Cheney wasn't just the Vice President of the United States, he was also the President of the United States Senate. That's why we dedicate a bust to him and to every Vice President. Many Vice Presidents have viewed that role as purely ceremonial, but not the one we're honoring today. When Dick was Vice President, he was up at our policy lunch most Tuesdays. He was an active member of the Senate. He sat there like a sponge and soaked up all the information, and we could rarely get him to say anything. Wasn't that we didn't think he had strong opinions, but he knew he was there for President Bush to figure out what we were up to. One of the instances I remember quite well relates to the Vice President's only opportunity to vote, and that's to break a tie. Here's the setting. We had what by today's standard was a rather modest deficit reduction package, which we could do through what we call in the Senate reconciliation. So we meant we could do it with 51 votes. I was the whip, the guy in charge of counting the votes. I counted, and I recounted, and I recounted. Remember, we had 55 Republicans at the time. I could only get to 50. Here was the complication. Dick was in Pakistan. Boy, I did not want to have this whip count be incorrect. So I had to call him in Pakistan, and it's 8.5 time zones away. God knows how long to fly back. And I said, we need you to come back. I sweated as he flew all the way back, hoping that we'd in fact have a tie. And alas, we did, and Dick broke the tie. That was my most memorable moment as the vote counter in the Senate. Eventually he made his way back, as I said, after all of those time zones, and mercifully, I was right in my count. We've had with us a president and a vice president who've taken very different paths in their post-presidency and post-vice presidency. One continues to engage passionately in the debates of the day. He writes, he speaks, he lets his opinion be known in no uncertain terms. The other views his role in a different way. He's done important work, but he's stayed home in the background. He's done humanitarian work, for instance, and he does something else too. He paints. Now, who can say which role is the correct one when you've left both of these important offices? It's a matter of personal opinion. But I know we're all looking forward to seeing more of President Bush's masterpieces. Thank you, everyone, for gathering today. Thank you, President Bush. Thank you, Vice President Cheney, for all of your remarkable service to our country over many, many years. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Honorable Paul Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I just want to welcome all of you to the Capitol Visitor Center, especially our honored guests and the Cheney family. So the way I see it, nobody could accuse Dick Cheney of living an inconsequential life. He was working in the White House on 9/11. He oversaw Operation Desert Storm. He worked at the side of Gerald Ford as that good man restored the presidency. He's dedicated his life to public service. And perhaps closest to my own heart, this is a man who witnessed the very first drawing of the Laffer curve. Now, given my position, I'm especially interested in his career as a congressman, a member of the People's House. He was elected in 1978. He served in the House for 10 years. And while he was there, he literally wrote the book on this place, Kings of the Hill, with his wife, Lynn. He vigorously supported Ronald Reagan in those times. And over that time, he rose in the ranks. The list of people he knew and people he befriended is like a who's who of the conservative movement. He succeeded Jack Kemp as the chairman of the House Republican Conference. Newt Gingrich succeeded him as the House Republican whip. He moved among giants in American politics. He is one himself. Later, of course, he left the House to become our defense secretary. He then went on to serve as the president of the upper chamber, which we in the House prefer to call that other chamber. And then he was never heard from again. I think the one thing people forget about Vice President Cheney is actually he is a really funny guy. I mean, I studied the vice presidential debates because I had my own vice presidential debate. And if you remember the 2000 vice presidential debate, he's up against Joe Lieberman. Joe Lieberman's talking up the boom times under President Clinton. And he says, "I'm pleased to see, Dick, from the newspapers that you're better off than you were 8 years ago." Candidate Cheney, without missing a beat, replies, "I can tell you, Joe, that the government had absolutely nothing to do with it." Joe Lieberman continues, "I can see my wife, and I think she's thinking, gee, I wish she could go into the private sector." Without missing a beat again, Dick Cheney says, "I'm going to try and help you do that, Joe." This runs in the family. Years later, when the vice president had his critics just going off the deep end, as they often did, he asked Lynn, his wife, "Does it bug you when people refer to me as Darth Vader?" And she said, "No, it humanizes you." That's what I'm going to always remember about the Cheney family, that wry sense of humor, that calm determination, the fierce love of country through all the years, through war and peace. He did all he could to keep this country safe. And we all owe him a tremendous debt of gratitude. Thank you, Vice President Cheney.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 43rd President of the United States, George W. Bush.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Please be seated. Thank you for the warm welcome. Lynn and all the Cheney family, I'm delighted to be here. I must confess I'm somewhat reluctant to come back to Washington. Last time I showed up here, I was hanged in the White House. This time, I've returned only to find my vice president getting busted in the Capitol. Really appreciate you being here, Vice President. Thank you for coming. I want to thank Paul Ryan for his leadership. He's trying out for the Abraham Lincoln look-alike contest. Thrilled to be with Mitch. When Dick was the president of the Senate, Mitch was the minority leader. And as a majority leader, Mitch is really in charge now. As a matter of fact, he assured me that Dick's bust would be prominently displayed in a undisclosed location. Orrin, it's great to be with you again. Thank you for your continued service, and of course Roy Blunt, who organized this event. William Behrens is the sculptor. I can't wait to see what it looks like, William. Reminds me of the time somebody did one of me and I look like Alfred E. Newman. Over the years, I've had the chance to meet a number of Dick's predecessors. I've known one of them my whole life. Last week, I told Mother and Dad I was coming here for the bust unveiling. Dad perked up and he said, "Send my best regards to old Iron Ass." Dick, that is indeed a badge of honor. The 43rd Vice President and 41st President asked me to give you his heartfelt congratulations. He and Mom join us all in thanking you for your selfless service to our country over the years. Dick is a man of the West, as people have mentioned. I find it interesting that he was the son of a Soil Conservation Service employee, that he laid power lines for a living before he got his degree from the University of Wyoming, after he got kicked out of Yale. He first came to this town in the late 60s as a PhD student working on his dissertation, which probably explains the special affection that Dick has always attracted from the world of academia. As others have mentioned, he worked on Capitol. In other words, all this experience mattered a lot. When I asked him to be the head of the Vice Presidential Search Committee. As he likes to tell people, if you ever get asked to chair such a committee, do it. Truth is, I knew all along that Dick Cheney had the character, integrity, and judgment that I needed and wanted as a running mate. He had the experience to step in as commander-in-chief if I were to get hit by a bus or choke on a pretzel. I'm fortunate that Dick Cheney agreed to serve as vice president, and so has our country. For 8 consequential years, I benefited from his wise counsel. He was a principled and trusted advisor on the most difficult questions facing our country. He's an effective advocate on Capitol Hill. He did an exceptional job as discharging his duties as the President of the Senate. Every single time Dick cast a vote, we won. And although he didn't spend much time speaking on the floor, he managed to convey a lot in a few words. Just ask Senator Leahy. People ask, do I miss Washington? And the answer is not really. I loved our time up here, but I'm happy to be home. I do miss some things, though. I miss saluting those who wear the uniform, and I miss my friends. And Dick Cheney is one of those friends. I always look forward to our weekly lunches. I could always count on him to take on any tough assignment, and I could always trust that the advice he offered was given with our country's best interests at heart. Dick became acting president for 2 hours and 5 minutes in July of 2007 while I was undergoing an undisclosed medical exam. He wrote the only document ever signed by an acting president, a letter to his grandchildren. In classic Dick Cheney fashion, he offered them a crisp piece of good advice: to always strive to do what is right. For 8 years, Dick stood by my side and always did what was right for our nation. Could not have asked for a better vice president than Dick Cheney. He's a good man who loves his country and really loves his family. Laura and I are proud to call Dick, Lynn, and their wonderful daughters friends. And I'm glad that his likeness will be an everlasting presence in these halls of democracy. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. As I look around this room and up on the platform, I want to say thank you for letting me crash your family reunion. I'm afraid, I said to Dick as I walked by, I'm afraid I've blown his cover. I actually like Dick Cheney. And I'm in the other family. I've had nothing but an inordinate respect for you, Dick, and I mean that sincerely. We started about the same time, you a little bit earlier, you with Rumsfeld in the late 60s, but when I got elected in '72, President Nixon was president, and when Gerald Ford took on that awesome responsibility in a difficult time, he turned to somebody to be a strong guiding hand. And he picked the right guy. He picked the right guy. And Mr. Speaker, you said that no one would challenge a statement you then went on to make. I would say that anyone who's thinking about challenging Dick Cheney should think twice before they set about doing it. And by the way, when we changed houses, Lynn, or changed residencies, there was a cartoon that was prominently repeated across the press of Dick showing me through the basement of the White House, and there were manacles on the wall, and there were skeletons, and you know, and Dick in the cartoon looks at me and says, "You may want to renovate a little bit." There was no such thing in the White House, and the only thing we ever received from the Cheneys in the White House was their good wishes and the way you tried to help us out. And I say to your daughters and to all your family, the thing that my family has cared deeply, and I hope we communicated that throughout the years about Dick's health, and I'm glad to see him in such great health. And Lynn, I want to thank you and Dick and your whole family for the kindness you've shown when I lost my son, and the generosity you showed in contributing to a memorial for him. So it means a lot. It's the part of Washington people don't see enough of. Dick and I have seldom had direct conflict, but we have gone at each other's ideas hammer and tong. But I can say without fear of contradiction, there's never one single time been a harsh word, not one single time in our entire relationship, not only to one another, but about one another. And you know, that's what's, I think, most desperately missing today in Washington, D.C. I don't ever remember, Dick, you questioning anyone's motive. You question their judgment, but not their motive. I learned that lesson a long time ago from who was then the leader of the Senate, Mike Mansfield, as a young kid. I came in, and remember our friend Orrin Hatch remembers that there was a guy who from South Carolina got elected, and I did, Jesse Helms, who actually became a friend. And I kept in touch with his wife, Arthie Dott, who just died about a month ago. And I remember walking down the floor. I'd show up once I didn't particularly want to be in the Senate at that time, and I'd show up once a week at the office of the Majority Leader. And he would give me every Tuesday, Mr. Justice, I'd get an assignment from the Majority Leader, and I would just turn 30, and I thought that's what happened. I thought Majority Leaders gave assignments for real. I saw how naive I was. And I realized after the fact he was just taking my pulse because of what I had been through, and I had said I'd only stay 6 months. A lot of people wish I'd kept that commitment. But one day I walked in, and a man later became my friend, Jesse Helms, was excoriating Bob Dole and Ted Kennedy for the precursor for the Americans with Disabilities Act. But I had to go to my meeting with the leader, and I went in, and I guess I looked upset. And I asked the question of him. He looked at me and said, "What's the matter?" He spoke in clipped tones. He said, "What's the matter, Joe?" And I went on to really go after Jesse. He said he had no social redeeming value. Why would he not help? And I went on and on. I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Joe, what would you say if I told you that Dott and Jesse Helms, I believe it was 1969, sitting in their living room in Raleigh before Christmas, there was an advertisement in the Observer, and there was a young man in braces, both legs up to his hips and crutches, and said all he wanted for Christmas was for someone to love him and adopt him." He said, "What would you say if I told you they went down and adopted that young man," which they did? I said, "I'd feel like a fool." He said, "Joe, it's always appropriate to question another man's judgment. It's never appropriate to question their motive because you don't know their motive. And when you question motive, it's virtually impossible to reach consensus." Dick and I could argue like hell about everything from foreign policy to domestic policy. But if we went at each other in personal ways, questioning motive, there'd be no possibility to reach a resolution. Quite frankly, Mr. President, that's why I enjoyed working with you, and I did. I think more than any other Democrat, I spent probably more time with you than any other Democrat. We disagreed, but it really never was disagreeable. I might add, if my dad were here, Mr. President, he'd look at you and say, "Kid, you got good blood." Your father, mark of the Bushes, and why the Bushes chose the Cheneys, is that I was recently in Houston, and I got a phone call from your dad's people saying he'd like to meet with me. And I said I'd be happy to come and meet with him. But he said, no, he wanted to come to my hotel and meet with me, which I thought was inappropriate. He's the President of the United States. I should go see him. But your dad insisted. Came in a wheelchair, a brace on his neck. You know what his agenda was? Welcome me to Houston. He thought it was appropriate. So, Dick, your career, as I look back on it, because it's about the same time frame, I don't think that there are many vice presidents, or for that matter, presidents, who have been in the eye of the storm on so many critical events in American history. From the transition of a presidency in the wake of an impeachment that didn't occur, to several wars, to the genesis of stateless actors that continue to threaten the social fabric of not only America but the world. And the thing about you, Dick, that I've admired most is you're absolutely steady and thoughtful. I disagree a lot. We disagree a lot. But I really mean it. It's amazing. There's one other thing that I'd like to mention. As I was riding up, I was thinking there's an unveiling of a bust. Well, you know, Lynn, the truth of the matter is that they should unveil a family bust. Because with your incredibly talented daughters and you, a woman of great talent, he didn't do this on his own. He really didn't. That sounds like hyperbole, but it isn't. The truth of the matter is, you have the same intellect and backbone that he has, and so do your daughters. And I want to thank them, by the way, personally for the phone calls. And this is a family affair. This doesn't just happen. One man cannot take on as many critical roles at critical moments without the overwhelming support of their family. And it's not easy. And so I think from now on, I'm going to propose that there be a family bust. Because I know, speaking for myself, and I have no doubt, I cannot speak for Dick, would never presume to, but this recognition today goes to you as much as it does to him, and that's not hyperbole. I mean that sincerely. I mean that sincerely. You know, I consider it a privilege, Dick, to know you, to have known you, have watched you work. I just wish the hell I could have changed your mind on a half a dozen things. But all kidding aside, you have been a great asset to this country, and the way you have personally conducted yourself is a model for anyone in high public office in this country. Thank you all very much.
Mrs. Cheney and the Cheney grandchildren, I think, are the designated unveilers here to join the Vice President and to get to do something that almost nobody gets to do. So, Vice President Cheney, if you'd join your family, we'll see what this looks like.
All right, are you ready?
Ladies and gentlemen, the 46th Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney.
Thank you all very much. Roy, I appreciate your hosting this event today, and I'm grateful to the friends and the former colleagues that are with us. I'm especially proud to note one friend in particular. Mr. President, thanks very much for being here and for all the years we shared together. Lynn and I are happy that all of you could have joined us on this particular occasion. Being cast in marble is something that every vice president looks forward to. It's not only a high honor, it's our one shot at being remembered. You see, Joe, there's much to look forward to. Although I might add that in the case of Vice President Biden, he'll be remembered for 44 years of faithful service in the Senate and in the White House. And we appreciate very much your being here with us this morning, Joe. I also want to note the presence of my good friend and one of the, I think, great justices of the Supreme Court. He's also a hunting buddy. And next year, Nino Scalia will mark his 30th year on the Supreme Court. I'm pleased as well to see the highest-ranking member of Congress here, my friend Paul Ryan. He's lately become a reminder to me that we don't always get exactly what we want in the world of politics. Somehow, Paul, I once aspired to be Speaker of the House and wound up as Vice President, while you ran for President and wound up as Speaker, as Vice President and wound up as Speaker. You got the job with the actual power and authority, and I got a very nice marble bust. Anyway, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the position that you're now in suits you very well. I'm glad you're here, and I think the country's much better off that we've now been able to persuade you to take on this major new assignment. I also want to thank our Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, and Chairman Reince Priebus of the RNC here for their presence. I've known Mitch many, many years. We did a great deal of work together, and it was always a pleasure to deal with the issues of the day. I want to thank many of the Cheney staff and alumni in the room who were colleagues here on the Hill or at the Pentagon and in the White House. Men like Scooter Libby, David Addington, Mary Madeline, Josh Bolton. We've also got Andy Card, Don Evans, Jim Nicholson, people that I was pleased to share many years with together in the course of my career. I especially want to mention and thank the members who served on my Secret Service detail, and some of them are here this morning, including Jimmy Scott, who pulled me out of my office on 9/11 and got me to a secure, undisclosed location. But they took great care of us during those years, that they looked out for me and my family, and they will always have our gratitude and our respect. Close observers of protocol will note this morning that the Cheney bust arrives a little ahead of turn, since the honors have not yet been done to the 45th Vice President, my predecessor Al Gore. Apparently there have been a few delays in the work on Al's likeness, and it may be that I'm somehow easier to carve into stone. The Senate Rules Committee was kind enough to schedule this event anyway. I appreciate the courtesy of Chairman Blunt, Trish Kent, and the entire Rules Committee staff. I thank as well the architect of the Capitol, Stephen Ayers, and everyone in the Senate Curator's Office for arranging my place in our diverse pantheon of Vice President. And special thanks to Barbara Willannon, who retired recently as the Curator of the Capitol. As to the sculptor's work, I guess I'm not the most objective judge. I wouldn't be the first politician who went into the sculpting process thinking that no piece from the quarry could ever do justice to that face he sees every time he shaves in the morning. But you can decide for yourself. Personally, I think it's excellent. I think Will's done a superb job, and I want to thank him as a true master of the venerable art. So thank you very much, Will Burns. If someone had told me as a young man that my name would one day rank in the list that included men like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Harry Truman, I would have been amazed. Any such scenario would have seemed like a real stretch for the man who, in my early 20s, was building power line and transmission line across the state of Wyoming and beyond. In the short version, a few breaks came my way. One job always led to another in a life that's taken me to far more places than I ever expected. It took me into this Capitol for the first time in 1968 with the hopes of working for a guy named Don Rumsfeld as his congressional fellow. During that first interview, he made it clear to me that I was not what he was looking for and threw me out. A few months later, he saw the error of his ways and recruited me to be his assistant during that first term of the Nixon administration. When Jerry Ford became president, he accepted me on Don's recommendation and later made me White House Chief of Staff. Don Rumsfeld and Jerry Ford fundamentally changed my life. A decade later, I returned to the Capitol as Wyoming's sole member in the House of Representatives. I want to thank the Wyoming delegation for being here today. I had the great good fortune when I arrived in the House to begin a lifelong friendship with Bob Michael, who's with us today. Bob from Illinois was our Republican leader. He took me under his wing. He taught me everything I needed to know to speak for the people of Wyoming effectively in the House of Representatives. I'm glad you're here, Bob. I fully intended to spend my career in the Congress, but will always be grateful to President George H.W. Bush for asking me to join his administration as Secretary of Defense. It was a special privilege to serve with the men and women of the United States military and to work with the President through Operation Desert Storm, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. If you had to design an individual to serve as Commander-in-Chief during those times, it would look a lot like George H.W. Bush, and I was proud and honored to serve him. I don't recall exactly when I was first introduced to President Bush's eldest son, but I must have made a half-decent impression. When the time came, Governor Bush needed a running mate, and I got the notion that I could help him find one. That search committee was a diligent little enterprise, and before long we found our man. In political history, the names of running mates are always bound up together, all the more if they end up winning. The Bush-Cheney ticket managed to win twice and without a little suspense. And all through those 2,922 days, we served together, handling serious matters in serious ways. I worked for someone who I respected and liked without reservation. He's a man of great strength, also great gentleness. He has integrity, a sense of humor, and an utter lack of pretense. And all of these are what we who shared in that journey will remember. I've been granted a few distinctions along the way in politics, and there's none I prize more than to have my name there in the story of those years besides the name of our President, George W. Bush. You'll understand, I think, today, if today I think of another Richard Cheney, my dad. Anyone who knew him can tell you that the name was plenty good by the time it was given to me. And I know my sister Sue and brother Bob would say the same. Only more in this season of life, I remember and appreciate both my dad and my mom, Marjorie, for what good, kind, upright people they were, and how enormously lucky I am to be their son. And how could I conclude an occasion like this without mentioning my historian wife? She's not a woman easily impressed, but I thought surely this final honor would do it, a bust of me in marble here in the Capitol building. I reminded Lynn this morning that if the Cheney family had not moved to Casper, Wyoming in the early 50s, we never would have met, and she would have married someone else. And Lynn responded, right, and today we'd be dedicating his marble bust in the Capitol. This is enough to say that I'm glad fate worked as it did, placing me in proximity to Lynn Vincent, keeping her close by those 50 years and more. It's been a gracious walk through the years, and it's been such a joy with our daughters Liz and Mary and their families, and now with the 7 grandchildren I've lived to know and cherish. I especially want to thank this morning as well my medical team, some of whom are here today. They saved my life on a number of occasions and made all this possible. Over the years, they not only kept me alive, but they made it possible for me to lead a very full and active life. And I'm very thankful for what they've done for me over the years. It's a tremendous honor to think that this bust will reside here in the U.S. Capitol. Every now and then, even in the distant future, someone will surely wander by the old Cheney bust, maybe even stop for a moment or two, trying to recollect something of the man and the era. And whatever else that name in front of them might evoke, I would want them to know this much at least. Here was a believer in America, so fortunate in his life experiences, so blessed in his friends, and so grateful all his days to have served as Vice President of the United States of America. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stand as the chaplain of the United States Senate, Dr. Barry Black, gives the benediction.
Let us pray. Eternal God, who rules the raging of the sea, thank you for the gift of Vice President Richard Cheney and for his many contributions to this great nation. Continue to bless and keep us. Sustain us as we seek to take a stand on the side of love, peace, and justice. Lord, use us to cause justice to roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. Continue to keep us without stumbling or slipping. Present us before the presence of your glory one day with exceeding great joy. You are the only wise God, and to your name we ascribe glory, majesty and might, dominion and power, now and always. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for the departure of the official party. Ticketed guests are invited to a reception in Statuary Hall. Please see an usher for guidance to the reception.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.